Good afternoon. I'm Robert Pondiscio. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday afternoon to talk about the California math framework. And look, let me just say at the outset, it's a little bit weird to be talking about education topics given what's going on in the world and the news of the week. But as I've said for years, good times and bad, kids wake up and go to school. So those of us who are in the business of education and hopefully making those schools a little bit better, we don't get to take the time off. So with that, acknowledging that awkwardness, let's jump into today's conversation, which is about the California math framework, which has ignited a firestorm of controversy in the math world. Much of today's conversation will focus on a series of pieces that one of our guests, Tom Loveless, has written in the magazine Education Next, including most recently the title of the piece, California's New Math Framework Doesn't Add Up. And Tom, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes, has been a fairly a thoughtful critic of those math frameworks, which call for de-emphasizing memorization, stressing problem solving, collaboration, promoting a more conceptual view of math rather than, say, an algorithmic or rules-based version of teaching math, with an aim, of course, towards equity and social justice. Why would this matter to non-Californians? Well, I think you all know this, but California has almost 6 million students in its K-12 public schools. And for years, it's been broadly acknowledged that as goes California, so goes the rest of the world, meaning it is, along with Texas, perhaps the largest textbook state in the country. So publishers and other producers of math materials are likely to cater to that California market. So what's good for California or bad for California will affect almost certainly math instruction and math materials in the rest of the country. Some broader context for today's conversation as well. I think everybody knows this as well. NAEP scores are down across the board. Math is not an exception. In fact, math may be worse. Fourth graders scored 236 on the NAEP math test in 2002. That's down from 241 in 2019. Obviously, the pandemic was the factor there. Eighth grade NAEP went from 274 down to 274, I should say, from 282 in 2019, which is a decline equivalent to 0.21 standard deviations. Look, this is a poor time in general because of that backdrop for instructional uncertainty. We've all heard the dire reports about learning loss, so this seems like a good time to have clarity on what classroom instruction is going to look like, not these kinds of controversies. So with that, let's jump into our conversation, and I'll introduce today's guest. Tom Loveless, who I already referred to, is a former senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. He authored 16 volumes of Brown Center Report on American Education, which is an annual report analyzing important trends in education. I'm a former fifth grade teacher. Tom is a former sixth grade teacher. I'm not a former Harvard policy professor, however, and Tom is. He's an expert on student achievement, education policy, and reform in K-12 schools. He's published widely in scholarly journals and appeared in popular media to discuss school reform, student achievement, and other education topics. Before he was at Brookings, Tom was an assistant and associate professor of public policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and a classroom teacher at the San Juan Unified School District. His most recent book in 2001 was Between the State and the Schoolhouse, which examines the Common Core standards. Sorry, I believe it's a 2011 book.
21.
Thank you, 2021, which examines the Common Core state standards from the initiative's promising beginnings to its disappointing outcomes. Also joining us today is Kara-Jean Hyde. She is the director of the University of California Irvine Math Project and a master teacher with the UC Irvine's School of Education Cal Teach program. In her role with IMP in the past 21 years, she's been able to partner with over 30 school districts throughout Southern California to help them organize and support the teaching of math content standards. She's led over 13,000 hours of professional development for K-12 teachers, as well as writing hundreds of lessons, exams, homework assignments performance tasks, discourse and reasoning routines, and unit outlines. She helps districts create math pathways to meet the needs of all learners. This includes creating both intervention and accelerated courses. She's also conducted hundreds of hours of demonstration lessons in both high needs and high achieving schools, so she's seen a range. She has been the co-director of multiple grants, including a $14 million National Science Foundation grant. In her role with CalTeach, Kara-Jean teaches math methods courses to undergraduate students who aspire to be secondary mathematics teachers. So I'm particularly glad to have Kara-Jean here to talk about what the math frameworks will look like on the ground. Actually, even before we get to that, this may be too basic, but I want to do it anyway. Can we start, Tom, by explaining, especially for those of us who are not classroom teachers, what is a framework and how does that differ from, say, standards and curriculum? Let's just level set that if we can.
Yeah, the frameworks which California has had going back many decades, back at least to the 1960s. The earliest framework that I have in hard copy was published in 1962, and it's a social studies framework. The frameworks are intended to give guidance to local districts and to schools on how they can achieve standards. So the standards are essentially a set of goals. California is a Common Core state. It adopted Common Core. Common Core, unlike many states, has not been controversial in California at all. And so that's a unique setting. The framework is intended to give guidance. It also gives guidance because California is a state adoption recommender. Again, these terms, it's not really a state adoption state anymore. It used to be. California gives guidance as to the adoption of math textbooks. So the framework will shape not only instruction through its recommendations, if people follow them, but it'll also affect programs that are adopted in terms of textbooks.
Okay, so there are standards. Here's what students should know and be able to do. The framework is the how-to, so to speak, that puts flesh on the bones and from which curriculum writers will write textbooks and unit plans and whatnot. And the framework itself is a rather massive document. Am I correct?
About 1,000 pages.
About 1,000 pages. Okay, so as a practical matter, this may not be what, I shouldn't assume, you tell me, is this what teachers will take down from the shelf in planning their lessons?
No, they don't usually consult frameworks in planning their lessons. The textbooks, however, are influential, especially at the elementary level for planning lessons, not as much in middle schools and in high schools.
Okay, and before we dive into some of the issues that you've surfaced with that, Tom, I want to just introduce Kara-Jean and ask her to talk a little bit about her role in this in terms of, I assume, Professor Hyde, correct me if I'm wrong, basically translating those frameworks into classroom practice, right?
Yeah, very much so. So especially with the teacher ed programs, like people becoming teachers, frameworks, a tool we use quite a bit to help them understand not just the standards, but what that might look like and what it is. And then with in-service teachers out in the classroom, especially in 2013 with the framework we had then, that's when, as Tom mentioned, the teachers aren't pulling them off the shelf. In fact, my 1997 framework I used to use to prop up a projector in my classroom when I was a middle school teacher. That's the most use I ever got out of that. So teachers don't normally look at them, but when we go out and do professional development with the 2013 one, we would actually have them read sections of that framework that explained the mathematics to them, especially with different standards. So for example, why are fractions equivalent? What does it mean to prove that a fraction is equivalent based on, multiplying it by, n over n? And there's letters and variables in the framework for elementary school, which most elementary school math teachers were freaked out about. Why is there algebra in my framework? So we would spend time helping them understand the standards and the framework back in 2013. So that's kind of how it rolls out to teachers in service is through professional development. And then in the teacher ed programs, in the past 10 years, the framework has been used quite a bit, but it will be a little bit different moving forward now.
Okay. And by the way, I was remiss in the introduction in not sharing with our audience that if you would like to submit a question at some point, you can do it on Twitter, or as it's now called X, using the hashtag CA Math Framework. So the state abbreviations for California, CA Math Framework, or you can email Greg Fournier, whose email is on the website for this event. Okay, so Tom, I don't want to do injustice to your series of articles in EdNext, which have been quite critical in the framework. So could I ask you to take a couple of minutes and just briefly summarize the main thrusts of your critique of the California math framework?
My criticism, I tried to confine to K through 8, because other people had taken up the critique of middle school and high school mathematics, and I thought K through 8 was somewhat left out of the discussion. So I raised actually 2 big objections to the framework. The manner in which the framework deals with kids learning basic facts. And by basic facts, the Common Core standards call for children to know addition facts by memory by the end of 2nd grade and multiplication facts by the end of 3rd grade. The California framework, especially in its earlier drafts, and there were 3 drafts of the framework before it was eventually adopted by the state board. The drafts, one of the things I did when I got the very first draft was to just simply do a word search of any form of the word memory. So memorization, memorize, memory. And I found 27 references, and in each of those, the idea of kids memorizing basic facts was disparaged. It was poo-pooed. It was statements such as, knowing basic facts doesn't mean simply memorizing them. Well, but it does include memorizing them. Yeah. If you're going to know basic facts to automaticity, and that's a key word, then you have to be able to recall them from memory, which is what this is what the California math standards demand that teachers accomplish by the end of 2nd and 3rd grades. So I wrote in my article about how, in essence, the framework, which is designed to help teachers acquire and implement the standards, actually contradicts the standards in terms of its stance on memorization. The second issue that I raised had to do with standard algorithms, and it's very similar to the problem with memorizing basic facts. Standard algorithms refer to the conventional way that we have kids do multi-digit addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Those are the 4 main operations. And these are ancient ideas. Arithmetic's been taught for a long time. As long as schools have existed, arithmetic has been taught. The California math framework, in terms of its statements on algorithms, just really doesn't talk a whole lot about how teachers will be teaching standard algorithms. And again, although the standard algorithms need to be learned to automaticity, the framework actually, again, kind of poo-poos this idea that kids would be able to use those algorithms automatically. So those were my 2 main objections in the elementary grades.
But if I'm hearing you correctly, it's literally sending mixed signals to California teachers. The standards are saying one thing, the framework is saying another. Surely you can't be the only person who's pointed this out.
No, I'm not the only person. There have been parents and there have been mathematicians who have pointed this out as well. So I'm not the only person.
And obviously you're a critic, not a defender, but what is the defense that's being offered for that?
The defense, in terms of, if you look at the alternatives to standard algorithms, let's take the second one first. And by the way, I think there's some justification in this complaint. math reformers, and I'm talking about progressive education math reformers who believe in inquiry as opposed to explicit instruction, what they have criticized, and there is some truth to this, is that in many classrooms, far too many classrooms, standard algorithms are taught without any meaning whatsoever.
Yeah.
So kids learn long division and they just learn, divide, multiply, subtract, bring down, and then do that over and over and over again. And without meaning, and unfortunately, there is so much meaning in long division. The long division algorithm is jam-packed with meaning because it has all four operations, which is very unique for an algorithm. But what the framework does is encourage teachers to use strategies, and I think teachers should be using strategies. They encourage teachers to teach kids alternative strategies for long division, for example, and there are many different ways of doing multi-digit division. They just emphasize those strategies and they kind of leave out any emphasis on standard algorithms. And yet the standards, as I said, do call for kids to be able to use these algorithms fluently.
Okay. Yeah, I want to get to some of the intellectual kind of ideological underpinnings of this in a moment, but what you just said, Tom, raises a question for Kara Jean, which is, would I be correct in assuming that teachers must be coming to you and saying, "Professor, help me out. What am I supposed to do with these mixed messages? Because the standard is saying one thing and the framework says another." Is that a fair? Are you seeing that?
They will. Again, as
Okay.
the issue is most of your public school teachers right now don't even know that California voted on a framework this summer. It's they're busy doing their job, like just teaching kids with what they have. So that's why when you mentioned earlier about textbooks, especially at the elementary level, that's what will be influential. Teachers are generally kind people that believe the best about everybody, and so when the district gives them a book or a trainer says to do this, they kind of just do it. So they're mostly unaware at this point that there is a framework that says something different than kind of what they had been doing. So at some point it will come up, but it's come up over the past 10 years specifically, just about when can I give them the algorithm, how can I, because with just the Common Core standards talking about strategies, for example, with addition, subtraction algorithm strategies in grades 2, 3, algorithm officially in grade 4, conversations have always come up about, well, can't I give them the algorithm in grade 2 if they basically understand the algorithm? So that's been an ongoing debate the past 10 years, but more about the teachers just saying, hey, what's good for my kids and for their parents, as opposed to being, as worried about conflicting with what the framework says.
Sure. One of my first memories when I became a second career teacher, over 20 years ago, I had an early PD. I was teaching fifth grade in the South Bronx. I had an early PD on math instruction, and I will never forget this. The staff developer told us that making children memorize their times tables, her phrase, is child abuse, which surely that can't be so. But it left an impression on a new mid-career teacher. So clearly this argument has been going on a very long time, and I think a lot of us, Tom, just think what my impulse was, what the hell's wrong with memorizing times tables?
Right.
I know this has been a more than 30 or 40 year war, but can you briefly summarize for us exactly how we got to the point where we've set these two ideas: conceptual understanding. Sure, of course, I want kids to understand, what the math they're doing, but just why are we so determined to set that and fluency at in conflict with each other?
Right. Well, the math wars of the 1990s, I think, is what you're referring to. But actually, the wars began long before that. Progressive education really had its heyday in the 1920s and 1930s, and like Diane Ravitch's book, Left Back, has many, many examples of progressive educators. And by the way, progressive educators has nothing to do with progressivism or progressive politics. It's a completely different thing. But progressive educators, for instance, in the 1930s, took great pride in what they called activity learning, which meant real world math. We hear that all the time now. kids being outside, designing sandboxes and using their math skills to do real world activities. And the idea was that this would motivate them to learn mathematics. But the problem was, and it became evident very quickly, there wasn't a whole lot of math involved. If you're building a sandbox, yes, you use math, but it takes a long time to do those things. So in the 1990s, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, NCTM, had adopted its own standards in 1989. It was endorsed by virtually everyone, but that coalition began falling apart in the 1990s. And California, by the way, was a hotspot for the math wars.
Sure.
There was a framework in 1992 that was the primary author was Phil Darrow, who went on to be one of the co-authors of Common Core. And the 1992 framework kind of blew up. There was a lot of controversy in California. And the idea was, much like we've already discussed, that things like basic facts and standard algorithms were disparaged or ignored, and the kids were learning in too many inquiry situations. The current framework that we're discussing uses the phrase big ideas to convey this inquiry-based approach to learning mathematics. And the standards of 1992 were simply routed from schools. They were defeated. They were replaced by traditionalist standards that were written primarily by 4 math professors at Stanford University. And that regime lasted until Common Core was adopted. One more point, as Kara Jean just mentioned, the current teachers are operating under the previous framework. They really haven't yet encountered the framework that was just adopted this summer. And that framework, too, was aligned to Common Core. It was a Common Core framework. So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay. Is it foreseeable, Kara Jean, how these frameworks or the new framework and again it's not fully adopted yet. That's going to do for later this year, right, Tom?
No, it's adopted. It's just hasn't been implemented yet. So,
forgive me, wrong term. How likely is this to create a watershed change in on the ground classroom instruction, as opposed to what we sometimes see where teachers just shut the door and do what they've always done? I mean, what is the process?
So the biggest driver will be textbook publishers first, and then professional development second. Those are the 2 ways that kind of a teacher gets information about what's happening. They can go to a conference, like California has a big, California Math Conference, or as Tom mentioned, the NCTM conference, but generally be through books. So if the publishing companies are supposed to be following this framework, that's where teachers are going to notice, and there are some books already out available that districts are piloting that are much more in line with this 2023 framework, where you might just have a single problem that's your math lesson that kids are going to discuss and do some things from, or very no explicit instruction is in some of these publishers that are out there right now. Some of your big publishers will have something similar to what they've had the last 15 years. So teachers will get it that way, as well as training. So a decent amount of money at the State Board of Education, when they adopted the framework in July, that was a big push of there's got to be a lot of money to go into training of in-service teachers about the new framework. So it'll depend on who's running your training, kind of what you're told as a classroom teacher. And as Tom had mentioned earlier, the lower the grade levels, the more likely teachers are to just do what they've been given. A lot of elementary school teachers aren't confident in mathematics. They're not going to question or challenge things, and they're going to kind of go with whatever the book has or I'm told. Middle school's in between, and high school, some of your high schools have still not really even adopted Common Core standards, and they're teaching what they've taught for 20 years. And, my kid's pre-calculus book has been around for 25 years that he brought home this year. So it depends a little bit on the level of what you're doing and what you're given, and how much you'll just kind of comply versus question things versus fight back. And again, it'll also be after implementing for a while. So teachers have to try something for a while if they're just given it, before they start to push back and say, hey, hold on, my kids aren't learning, or my kids are struggling, or the middle school saying, what's going on at the elementary schools? Our kids can't multiply. And then the high school saying, what's going on at the elementary schools? Our kids can't multiply.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask this question, the last kind of nutsy bolty questions, because before we get into some of these kind of ideological issues, correct me if I'm wrong. My assumption is that we're not talking about changing the state assessments so that we will have a referendum fairly quickly. I mean, unlike literacy, where language is, I always say, is a slow-growing plant, math is a little bit more instructionally sensitive. At least that's my impression. So we'll have an up or down series of results on this relatively, comparatively quickly. Correct or incorrect?
You're correct. The assessment won't change. The assessments don't necessarily gauge the full impact of frameworks and of changing frameworks. Like we've already stated, California was a Common Core state with Common Core standards before the adoption of this new framework, and it still is. So, and it's a smarter balanced assessment state, and it still is a smarter balanced state. So.
Okay, so as somebody,
one thing I wanted,
please.
Sorry, just one thing to add on to that. The one big concern would be, if we lose the assessment. So, there's issues with standardized assessment, but it is at least a goalpost to say, where are the kids at in terms of things. It will be a little hard to notice a whole lot because, 2/3 of the state of California is below proficient, not meeting standards. But it is a kind of a debate happening right now about standardized assessment and should that go away. And, from my end as a practitioner, if we lose some type of standardized assessment, we lose the ability to measure where kids are at, which means we would lose the ability to be able to know if they need intervention or what's going on or how to support the students.
Okay. Tom, one of the questions that I had when in reading your series of articles in EdNext, in the history of math reform in California, and you'll correct me if I'm summarizing this incorrectly. So you had a framework in 1992, which everybody liked. Math reformers across the country, or math educators across the country, seemed to support. If I'm not mistaken, math or California at one point was one of the leading NAEP states in California. So if things were going well, how did the traditionalists, as I think you call them, how did they lose the upper hand here? If they had the whip hand in math instruction for years, how did that fall away?
I will correct you. The 1992 framework was the controversial one that was eventually booted out in 1999 and replaced with a traditionalist framework.
Okay.
That framework was very popular in some quarters among traditionalists. It was very popular. It was rated. It had A grades on all the Fordham ratings of standards. So but it essentially ended when Common Core was adopted.
Okay, so this is a lead into the kind of the philosophical battles that have gone back and forth. And again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Tom, but the picture that comes from your work at EdNext is that this is essentially an ideological struggle in California, and maybe you can kind of shape the contours of that for us a little bit.
Well, the argument over mathematics that has been going on for, as I said, over 100 years, between traditionalists and progressive educators, just has never stopped. And one side wins for a while and gets their beliefs enshrined in public policy, but it doesn't last forever. And that's what's happened this time as well. I wanted to add one point to how these standards get implemented downstream, and it's a very important one. As I mentioned, there were 3 different iterations of the California framework. The first one was the most radical in terms of endorsing certain practices. For example, one of the stipulations in the initial framework, the version number 1, was that all kids would take the same math courses through 10th grade, and there would be no more allowing children who were advanced in mathematics to take algebra in 8th grade. Now, all of the language about that has been toned down in the version 3 that was adopted by the state board. But that doesn't matter, because what happens downstream is you do have people who are very much against tracking. And they believe ideologically that all students should be taking the same math course. And as I said, the original version of the California Math Framework endorsed that through 10th grade, that everyone would be taking the same courses. The language has been removed, but you still see districts who have gotten the message, and I often call these dog whistles, that are issued to district personnel and to school personnel. And if you have district personnel who believe very strongly that tracking is evil, and there are many educators who believe that, and by tracking, I just mean that kids take different math courses based on how much mathematics they already know. You may have some kids who are well prepared for algebra in 8th grade, whereas it may take others until 9th or even 10th grade before they're prepared enough to be successful at algebra. There are trade-offs when you allow kids to accelerate while others do not accelerate, but downstream implementers of the California Math Framework, they've already done it. They have already seized upon this as, look what the state is recommending that we do. The most famous example is San Francisco Unified School District, which after 10 years of insisting that all 8th graders take algebra, which was a disaster,
Right.
They then flipped around and said, no, that's not equitable either. Nobody can take algebra in 8th grade. So these two completely opposite ways to achieve equity. And equity, by the way, was not achieved at all. San Francisco has a horrible record in terms of its both Black and Hispanic students in terms of their math achievement.
Am I wrong that California still has a pretty healthy tech sector around San Francisco in the Bay Area? I mean, one of the other incongruities in reading your work, Tom, it seemed to me that if there's any state in this country that should be banging the drum for accelerated math and raising math standards, it would be the state in our country with the highest investment in the tech sector, right? So
yeah,
where are they?
There have been parents certainly who are very active. There was a group of parents in Palo Alto Unified School District that filed suit against the district over not allowing kids to accelerate. And there actually is there's law in the California Education Code that, and again, this was passed as an equity measure to make sure that Black and Hispanic students weren't shunted aside if they were qualified for algebra. So the state ed code says that you can't, for instance, you cannot make a kid repeat a course that they already successfully took and got an A in. And yet that's what some of these districts were doing. That a kid would transfer into the district from outside the state or outside that district, having completed algebra 1. Well, if you're in 8th grade, if you're in a district that says everybody takes algebra 1 in 9th grade, not in 8th grade, they were making those kids do that, and the parents filed suit, and so far they have an injunction, but that matter is still playing out.
You alluded earlier, and I want to get you to both respond to this one. This notion of big ideas in the framework. Can you just put some flesh on those bones? I mean, what are some examples of so-called big ideas in this framework? And so Tom first, and then for Kara Jean, what does that look like when it's implemented in the classroom? What's it supposed to look like?
Yeah, the big ideas are an effort to connect various standards and present them in a thematic way. And so it goes back, it's very much like the real world activities that I talked about in the 1920s and 1930s. And I'll let Kara Jean talk more about that.
Yep. So one of my major concerns is someone that helps teachers implement this framework is the fact that the content standards aren't listed anywhere in the entire 1,000-page document, and instead big ideas are meant to replace them. And I'm a very big fan of coherent big units for kids to learn. So math isn't 180 distinct ideas, but you tie things together. I'm 100% for engagement. Like I just did a lesson last week where kids made like pizza cookies. So you could pick different flavors and put it together and make a little pie out of 8. And we did all this fraction work with it. But the problem is the big ideas that are now, what teachers are supposed to teach to instead of the content standards, they weren't voted on by California. There are things like model with mathematics. There's some serious issues with, for example, in 4th grade, the big idea of fluency with the addition and subtraction algorithm that Tom talked about earlier. That's under the big idea of shape and symmetry. I have no idea how place value and addition and subtraction algorithm have anything to do with shape and symmetry. So it was trying to extremely, vaguely make these connections where the math connections didn't necessarily exist. So what will happen is you're going to maybe teach these big ideas, and there's 3 authors' names listed as writing these big ideas. Of those 3 authors, one of them has a BS in mathematics. None of them have a master's degree in math. None of them have a PhD in mathematics. And they were the authors of these big ideas during the digital learning time. So what I foresee as a practitioner happening is in a classroom, you have a teacher that says, okay, well, I'm going to do this big idea and this is what it looks like. And then another teacher will do something completely different. And what it leads to is significant inequity. So as much as maybe people don't love or agree with standards at least give us a baseline and says, this kid needs to have access to be able to learn these grade level standards no matter what. And the teacher is held accountable to that. When you have big ideas, and it says in this new version of the framework that these are one interpretation of a big idea, and in fact, grade level teams should meet and discuss their big ideas. When we get to that level, you have teachers that do have bias that would say, hey, these kids look different than me, so maybe they can't handle 6th grade math, which was my experience my 2nd year teaching. I had a teacher next door and said, you don't understand, these kids don't speak English, they can't learn standards. And that was my first into loving standards I ever had as an experience of like, I know these standards because these kids can and they will, and I'm going to help them achieve standards no matter where they start from. But the idea of big ideas is kind of relative. What's the big idea to you? What's the big idea to me? And if there's no standards listed out anywhere, I teach pre-service teachers also, they don't even know the standards. They have to go find them somewhere else. You're going to have greater gaps in inequity because a teacher will take a big idea and go in one direction with it, another will do another. They're not directly connected to all the standards which aren't listed out. And now we're going to have students in different classrooms with different teachers in different cities, not necessarily being held to learn the same standards. And I think the gaps are going to grow, which is a concern.
Yeah, because the parents who will go outside the school system, they'll purchase mathematical content knowledge, and their kids will be just fine. But the parents who can't afford that, who rely on public schools for their kids to learn math, their kids will not be fine. And that's Kara Jean put her finger on the worst part of the big idea promotion, is that content gets shuffled away. It becomes a content-free experience for kids, and that's just not good, especially in mathematics.
So is the intent, the author's intent, as it were, behind these frameworks? I've seen this in other realms outside of math literacy in particular, where the assumption is, look, in the hands of a master teacher, this is liberating, and they will be creative and bring this to life in their classroom, without mentioning the fact that most teachers really don't have that ability to help these reach full flower. I mean, is that what's going on here?
Yeah,
that's part of it.
So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And you can also see it in, there's a part of Common Core, it's called the Standards for Mathematical Practice. And a lot of the big ideas come from these standards of mathematical practice, which, by the way, go back to the NCTM standards of 1989. But the standards for mathematical practice in the Common Core documents take up about 8 pages. the content standards take about 80 pages. And what you see in the California Math, that's in Common Core documents. What you see in the California Math Framework is the content is missing in action. And these standards for mathematical practice are what drive the 1,000 pages. When you wade through the 1,000 pages, you see very little content. You see an awful lot about things like modeling, hypotheses, and this kind of stuff.
Was it? I think I heard you somewhere describe this as math appreciation as opposed to math.
That was some of the data analysis courses. One of the early versions of the framework actually set up like a separate track for kids to take data analysis all the way through high school, as opposed to taking Algebra 2, and especially at the end, they would take Algebra 1, then geometry, and then they would shift into a data analysis stream where they would take data analysis for the rest of their high school career. And this was sold on a false premise that this would prepare them for advanced work in data analysis in college, and that's absolutely false. And the people who actually know a lot about college requirements for data analytics oppose the framework on that basis.
Yeah. Speaking of false ideas in this, you were also in your pieces in NX, you took on the idea that these are research based. I can't remember the data, but as I recall, you said that within the framework, almost like a mantra, it's based on research, based on research, based on research. But your work has discovered not so, right?
Right. What I did was I looked at the IES practice guides, they're called, and these are guides for practitioners. They try to summarize the best research, which means either quasi-experimental or randomized controlled trials that investigate different ways, especially with struggling learners. You know, what do we do with kids who have a difficult time learning mathematics? And I took 4 different practice guides and their citations. In other words, what were their recommendations based on, and searched through the California Math Framework. And I only found, out of, I think it was 90 some odd studies, there was only 1 study cited in the California Math Framework. So the California Math Framework leaves out really our best research on how children learn. There was a practice guide on fractions. There's a practice guide on just focused on struggling kids who struggle with math, and the California Math Framework does not cite that body of literature.
Okay, so what do we do? The framework ship has sailed. This time next year, Kara Jean and folks like her will be helping teachers make sense of this. It sounds like it is too late through the standard processes to get this train off the track. If you are a teacher, well, let's take it. If you're a teacher or a parent in California, what's your recourse at this point? Kara Jean, you want to guide us out of this thicket?
Well, so on one end, it's for at least for what I get to do is continuing to educate teachers on there has to be balance between conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and this application problem solving. There has to be balance. I was a teacher in the classroom too. I don't want to be part of the pendulum swinging back and forth extremes. We need all of them. Students need to understand, for example, what a percent is, and that a percent is a relative number, and it's not always fixed. It changes depending on the whole. But they also have to be able to calculate percents, and then they have to figure out which coupon they should use when they go to the store because they're not all equal. So we need all 3 in balance. Our 2013 framework required, they defined rigor as equal intensity between conceptual, procedural, and problem solving. So as a teacher educator, I still want to make sure the districts I work with and the teachers know we need that balance. Kids need all 3 of those as we go. So then possibly we can help districts look at textbook adoptions and consider the materials we're putting before students. Do they reflect that balance and haven't gone to the extreme of all application? Even in the last framework, the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State of Schools had made a note about different curricula. And one of them said, being aware that extreme curricula that are focused only on application don't acknowledge the fact that math doesn't teach itself. We need some math actually taught in the classrooms. So we can help teachers understand the balance needed. We can help districts consider textbooks and materials, because that's going to be a huge thing of what gets implemented, to ensure that the standards are taught, that we keep standardized assessment, because that's how we're going to know who needs intervention, who's ready to accelerate. In my role, we also try to help districts make equitable pathways and options that allow acceleration in middle school, but also provide intervention in middle school. That give options for kids to accelerate in 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, so they can still become STEM majors. And we will actually have a STEM workforce that has math under them. So that's me on a teacher educator level, that I can continue to try to do that, that we can, to help teachers and new service, pre-service teachers understand the standards and go. But for me, I probably have to go back to the 2013 framework and pull it out, because that actually talks about the standards and how to teach it. And in this case, we're going to have to convince teachers that they still do need that balance from there. And then in terms of parents, it's a lot on educating. A lot for parents is understanding pathways, and that you need your students proficient in mathematics, helping them understand the required fluencies and helping teachers do that. I mean, we're building intervention courses at the high school where the teachers are like, my kids need the multiplication fact still. So we're building courses for that, but parents being aware of this is what your kids need to know fluently by when, so that they can be successful. Because one of the arguments, and I know Tom's brought that up too, is, hey, they're going to use a calculator. They don't really need to learn this stuff. But you watch a kid in a high school class trying to factor a quadratic expression with, they need two numbers that multiply to 72 and add to 17, and they got their calculator out. And like 8 minutes later, they found the two things in the calculator. Well, the rest of the class is on number 15, and now they're behind. So we have to help parents and administrators and schools understand what kids need and make sure that they have those fluencies. They're mastering math based on the standards before they're moving on. And if they're moving on without it, do we provide them intervention? And then do we provide acceleration in middle school and in high school to challenge those kids?
Yeah, you didn't use this phrase, but what I think I just heard you say, Cara-Jean, is ignore the framework.
There's definitely some good intentions in some parts that are there. Like, for example, supports for English learners, or in California, that's most of our work. I'm in Southern California. So I taught in a district 98% language learners. So there's some incredible parts that you absolutely want to use that are good and good by kids. But in terms of actual instruction, there's big picture things like teaching the standards and ensuring that kids master mathematics and keeping standardized assessments there, that we have to make sure kind of continue to happen. Districts could have, 15 years ago, could have bought some curriculum that was one extreme or the other. So it's always an issue of trying to educate the administration. The parents are part of the adoption process in California. Parents have say on textbooks being adopted. So it's more of just the education about what does good math look like, and empowering parents and teachers who are afraid of math, who say, well, I won't touch it, because I don't know math, I'm not good at math, to say, no, you can have a say in this. Let's understand what balanced math instruction looks like and what you need to have and do, and be able to fight for that for your children and for your school. And especially for me, for our Black and Hispanic students, they absolutely need standards-based curriculum that develops conceptual, procedural, and problem solving in equal intensity with supports to make sure that they can access and succeed in STEM careers should they choose.
Yep. And to the question of, what happens now, what happens next, I think there'll be two arenas where we're going to just play out this debate again. One will be at the state level, and that will involve textbook programs, because the adoption process will begin sometime this fall, or sometime real soon. We're in the fall. So, and that'll extend into next year. So that gives another opportunity for opponents of the framework to make themselves heard. And secondly, as I've stressed, these are just recommendations for local districts. You will get pushback from some districts. There will be districts that just repudiate the framework. There'll be others that say, well, there are parts of it that we like and we think are appropriate for our kids, but other parts that we don't. So you'll also see local level involvement with either accepting or rejecting the framework as well.
Yeah, I'm going to betray my ignorance of the world of math textbooks and textbooks at large, but it occurs to me, I simply don't know where textbook publishers will take their lead. Will it be from the standards or will it be from the framework? And based on that, how will that affect the decision making that's made at the district level in California? Do either of you know what prism the textbook publishers will view this through?
So there's a chapter in the framework that is specifically about textbook publishers and adoption and criteria they have to pass to be able to make it onto California's approved adopted list.
Okay.
It does include, teaching towards big ideas, but it also does include that standards have to be met, content standards and math practice standards. So there is a guide that ironically is more kind of conservative in principles and old school than the actual framework itself. So publishers, they do have to actually list out every single standard, even though the framework itself doesn't. But that's going to kind of be the direction they go. But within that, there's a lot of latitude. Even in the 2013 framework, with what was adopted and put in the adopted list, you had quite the range of materials, from something that was completely problem-based, application-based, to something that was completely traditional. So it's fairly easy. It's a difficult process to get adopted, but it's fairly easy in terms of not having to meet everything the framework says to get adopted. So books that, barely taught. So the last round, there was a book adopted that had a single problem in grade 6 with an exponent in it, even though exponents are supposed to be taught in grade 6, but it passed the adoption list because it had one problem with one example in it. So there's guidelines for publishers, but they're going to kind of publish the direction they want to go already. And again, there's already a couple of books that have come out in the last 2 years that districts are looking at. Some districts have already adopted in California. Some are piloting right now to adopt. Some are going to wait to adopt. So it's already out there. So it really is a matter of how do we get messaging out to school boards and school districts and teachers and parents, especially ones that are wanting to do what, socially justice backed things, but helping them understand that what's socially just is to make sure kids learn math. That's our number one goal, because that's the way that children have a chance to improve their future is being strong in mathematics. But the books are, half of them are written, some of them are already out, some of them will be out in the next couple months. So it's more kind of an education campaign, which is why people like Tom writing articles and you hosting forums, and Brian Conrad out of Stanford recently being able to share about the research and the issues with that are huge things to try to educate the public so that we make good decisions from this guidance that we've been provided.
I want to make sure I'm really clear on what you just said, Kara-Jean, because this is critical. Are you suggesting that the textbook companies are savvy enough to write quality materials despite these frameworks by adhering to the standards? Yeah. So you can have some publishers that have some pretty decent, what I would consider decent material. And then you'll have publishers where you're saying, please don't adopt that book because that's going to destroy some children, and you won't use it. The teachers will adopt it, use it for 2 or 3 years, realize our kids aren't learning math. But again, why do we have to go down that road? I kind of relate it to what's happened with phonics and whole language over the past 10 years. Yeah. We don't need to go down that road first to say, let's remove all procedural fluency. Let's remove the focus on memorization for the goal of whole language. We don't need to do that in math and have teachers try out some of these books for 3 or 4 years and then say, oh, wait, shoot, we should have gotten that book. It was a good theory, but it didn't actually work. We need to make sure we're picking the accurate books now. And there will be publishers that are going to do, better in terms of having a good balance of what kids need to become proficient in mathematics. Yeah, I don't want to make connect dots that aren't there, but I am struck by how in literacy, which is where I live and breathe, you've had honestly a teacher-led movement to say, hey, look, I was trained badly. The ideas that I have about literacy are clearly not working. To use Emily Hanford's famous podcast title, they were, quote, sold a story. Do we see anything like that happening among math educators?
Not yet. But we also lack good evaluation evidence on what are the effective textbooks. And we need much more of that. We need more of it in reading too, by the way. So the typical way, let's say an organization like edreports.org, which provides evaluations of textbooks, the way they do it is they have a checklist of things they're looking for in good textbooks. And these are things that have been found to be important to making a good textbook. And then they look for those things, and a committee decides, yes, this particular book has it or has many of these ingredients, and another book does not. But the one thing they don't do is have evidence as to whether or not a particular textbook effectively teaches literacy or effectively teaches mathematics. The part I think is really funny about, and not funny in a good way, about edreports.org is they have a session where they look at usability of textbooks. And edreports.org calls itself the consumer reports of education and of educational instructional materials. Consumer reports, if you're looking for whether or not a toaster works, they actually use the toaster, and they say, we cooked this, we cooked a small pizza, we cooked toast, we cooked all these different things. EdReports does not have the teachers on its committee go and use the textbooks and then report back, yes, this was a usable textbook. It just has teachers report, this looks usable to me. And that's what their committee makes its decisions based on. So we need real on-the-ground evidence that the book works, that teachers can use it effectively, that they don't have to spend, stay awake every night trying to figure out how to teach the next lesson. And that would go a long way towards, helping teachers out.
Good. It's time to throw this to audience questions in the 15 minutes that we have left. Let me, and forgive me, I'm just pulling these off of Twitter. I'll just throw them out in no particular order. Here's the first. How many California families bypass math instruction by hiring outside tutors? Doesn't this mask the negative impact of these bad reforms?
It can mask bad reforms, and it always has masked bad reforms, but we don't have a good number on that. As I said, in San Francisco Unified, we do know that San Francisco Unified has, and California is really a public school dominated state. Private schooling is not that popular in the state of California. In San Francisco, it's very popular. And San Francisco is kind of the test case for the California math framework approach, and for balanced literacy as well. And you've got, I think the estimate is around 30% of kids in San Francisco attend private schooling, which is unheard of in the state of California.
Yeah, and I can read Kara Jean's mind here. The kids who will be most affected by bad math instruction are the ones who are least likely to have access to tutors.
Yeah, till you're sold a story. My own children were at a district that was sold the story, so there was no acceleration in middle school, and so sure enough, I made sure my child got accelerated on his own with mom's help, which again I have the resources to do, but his classmates didn't.
Yeah. Keeping with that theme, here's a question. I'd like to raise the parallel of Lucy Calkins and how early literacy was impacted by an overwhelmingly widespread belief among educators that her approach was effective, and some of the reform math beliefs promulgated by Joe Bowler and the other framework writers. What parallels do you see, and do you have any comments about that, either of you?
There are some obvious parallels. Joe Bowler, who was on the California math framework and an important voice on that committee that authored the framework, is also the co-director of of an organization at Stanford called U-Cubed. And most of the ideas that we've talked about today, you can find on the U-Cubed website. It's compatible with the philosophical approach of U-Cubed. U-Cubed also gives professional development, where it charges, I think it's around $1,000 a teacher or $900 a teacher, something like that. It gives professional development on big ideas and how to implement big ideas. It gives professional development on many of the critical aspects of the California math framework. So there are, it also has a data analysis course, which it sells and gives professional development on that. So there is money to be made, but I want to say one thing in Joe Bowler's defense. Joe Bowler, 100 years, as I said, 100 years ago, people were arguing about how to teach math. I believe they will still be arguing 100 years from now. So Joe Bowler is an actor today, but these are ideas that have been in conflict for a long time. It's not Joe Bowler who caused this.
I love this question because we've talked about teachers and parents. We have not talked about school boards. So here's a question. Where can a school board member learn more about the best strategies for students to learn math? And then parenthetically, this person writes that currently almost all of the focus is on the science of reading.
That's a tough question. I think I know at least one group that's trying to put together advice to try to share with school boards. Because it's very limited knowledge in general. The school boards are very busy. They've got thousands of things they're dealing with. And generally math is not the area where they're confident to step in and say, hey, let's do this. So, in districts we get to work with, in some cases, they'll have study sessions to try to educate the school board members. But I think that's a huge area of need that I know at least someone out in California is working on trying to put together is a resource packet for school boards specifically to understand maybe an approach to how to implement parts of this guidance so that it's best for students.
Sorry, any
I'd recommend two places a school board member go to find out. One is the report of the National Math Panel, and full disclosure, I was on the National Math Panel, but the report really summarized everything we knew about effective mathematics instruction, curriculum, how to organize coursework, etc. You can find that online. It's free. And I would go to the IES practice guides I mentioned earlier, because they offer really solid recommendations based on good research.
Good. I think in general, school board members tend to take their cues from the experts on staff, from the superintendent, from the curriculum folks. So it's a real it's a potentially rich vein of ore to raise the level of sophistication for school board members in light of this. Couple more questions. Can the panelists comment on the research underpinning the California math framework, given Brian Conrad's exposing the misrepresentation of the findings of cited research in the framework, the omission of high-quality research from Works Clearinghouse, and the questions raised about various claims in the framework, which Tom Loveless comments on in his EdNext article. Tom, that's one for you, obviously.
Well, yes, and I'll give one example. And I mentioned the IES recommendations. One of the IES recommendations, it was by a practice guide that was the chair of the committee that edited the practice guide was Lynn Fuchs of Vanderbilt, who's a renowned researcher in math education. And that particular committee urged that kids who are struggling with automaticity really receive some direct instruction that tries to boost their ability to do to recall basic facts and to also perform algorithms quickly and efficiently. And so timed assessments were part of this. It doesn't mean necessarily timed tests where you stand over a kid with a stopwatch and say, come on, you have to go faster. That's not what's involved here. But the research does show, and over 20 studies were cited in randomized controlled trials, were cited showing that you really can improve kids' automaticity by giving them time tests. And kids like time tests. They can be a lot of fun, and they can give themselves time tests sometimes at home. So the California Math Framework takes a stand against any time tests whatsoever. And again, that's something that UCubed has campaigned against for a very long time.
Yeah.
If I could add on to that, on the other side of it, beyond not citing studies, I working at a tier 1 research university, was shocked when I actually looked at some of the references of how faulty some of the research was. I just assumed it was true, but there was a mention of, hey, this is how they do things in Japan. And so the citation was the Ministry of Defense. And I clicked on the link and it was a tutoring website. It had nothing to do with the Japanese government program at all. It was just blatant, like, there is no evidence here. He gave a citation and it didn't go to anything that related to anything. So there's a number of those that definitely bring up concern for what do I trust that's being claimed, because many claims are being made with wrong evidence, faulty evidence that says nothing about it, evidence about studies that had to do with adults, but they're claiming it works for children, or it was something that they did in a preschool classroom, but they're saying that's what happens in another thing. So that's definitely been eye-opening for me as also a naive. I just kind of trust if somebody put it in and they cited it, that it's probably accurate. But it's a major concern. It's not just, one or two, it's rampant throughout, which, Brian Conrad's uploaded papers that show. But it's definitely something we somehow have to cautiously help educators know, is that you can't just believe a line that's stated if somebody said there was a study that was based on it, because a lot of it's being misapplied or just blatantly mislabeled.
Yeah, Brian found, some of the findings that are claimed in the framework are the opposite of what was actually found in research. So I urge people, shout out for Brian, go to Brian Conrad's website and take a look. There are all kinds of misrepresentations of research.
Yeah, but to make an obvious point, as a practical matter, it's the rare classroom teacher that has the time to really do original reading and research themselves. They're relying, frankly, on folks like us to translate it for them. So we've been talking a lot about the parallels between math instruction and literacy, and this question gets to the heart of that one. It's kind of fascinating. How much of the framework math reform in general comes as a reaction to kids simply hating math, this person asks, and then invokes, the notion of Lucy Calkins trying to teach reading by simply fostering a love of reading, which resonates with me. I was a Calkins classroom when I was teaching in the South Bronx. So here's the question: Do framework opponents have like us, I guess I could say, have a readily available answer to the problem of math causing frustration and panic in kids?
So I would say to that question, yeah, people hate math in general. Parents are less confident, so they'll take whatever's there. But the framework has gone to an extreme of, like, for example, the word engagement appears 120 times, but mastery only appears 9 times. So, over 10 times as much, the focus is on engagement and authentic experiences and tasks. And again, we create lessons for teachers. And we take them outside and we do human number lines, and the kids are doing equivalent fractions on number lines, and they're running, and we do races to do slopes and rates of change, and we throw balls in high school classrooms. And so I'm all about engagement and relevance and fun. But that's not the entire lesson, isn't the fun part. It's this is a real world application that will, kind of engage you quickly, 10 minutes, and then we're going to do all the math that needs to be understood from that. So a big concern is the balance between, we start off by telling every district math should be fun, it should be engaging, and it should be meaningful. I fully believe that 100%. But there's also days where, you're going to sit in your desk quietly and do your work, because you have to develop your own procedural fluency. So we can alleviate math anxiety quite a bit through, let's have conversations, and how do you see it, and talk to me about how you see it, and let's do something fun and engaging and relevant. But then I also have to have a point where I'm pushing you to do something that, today it's not very fun. And I always relate that to sports. My kids are all, athletes, and that's, my daughter's a soccer goalie, and she doesn't want to juggle, and she has to, if she doesn't get enough juggles, she has to run extra 60-yard sprints. and she's a goalie. And I'm like, sorry, it's a good for you. And so, yeah, not everything's going to be fun and engaging and relevant, but you need that math. And the experts have told us you need this math so that you can be in the STEM workforce and you can empower our world. So we have to have a balance. And that's where, again, I keep bringing it up, but standards make the difference of it's not everything. And we can do a much better job of making math more fun and more engaging, but not at the expense of developing proficiency in the math.
I'm
learning.
chuckling. I'm just chuckling because I invoked that story that I was told early on about how making kids memorize times tables is child abuse. Well, I abused my fifth graders. They memorized their times tables.
Some of that, by the way, is exaggerated. Actually, kids don't hate math as much as we think. And when we ask little kids whether they like math quite a bit. It does fall off as kids get older in terms of their enjoyment of math. And the United States, by the way, in international assessments, when we ask kids if they like math, the United States, a much higher percentage of kids say they like math than in Finland or in Hong Kong or in Korea or in Japan. So our kids don't do as well on those tests as the kids in the countries I just mentioned, but they do say they like math more than the kids in those countries.
That is a unintentional good lead into another question from our audience. How do other countries teach math? Do they look more like the California math framework or more like traditional math instruction? Tom, I think you've written about this. As I recall, you wrote something when Elizabeth Green wrote her book about math instruction about 10 years ago.
Yes, and I also have a book, an edited volume called Lessons Learned, which is about what we've learned from international assessments, focusing on TIMS. And I was a co-author of a book called 20 Years of TIMS that was published in 2015. Other countries are mixed, just like we are, and it's very difficult to generalize as to how different countries teach mathematics. The best studies we have on this came from the TIMS video studies, which were done in the 1990s, where teachers were actually videotaped and then their lessons were analyzed. But there are even caveats with that. For instance, in Japan, one of the things you notice is that Japan teachers never even touch upon things like some of the fundamental skills that I've mentioned, basic algorithms and automaticity with basic facts. And the reason why they don't do that, by the way, is because kids in Japan, at least 2/3 of them beginning in 8th grade, go to school after school called juku. And what the juku does is emphasize the acquisition of basic skills. They're just drilled on basic skills. So in a sense, what Japanese schools have done is they have offloaded the emphasis on basic skills to an outside agent, in this case, the jukus. And in South Korea, you have this exact same thing. South Korea actually has a police force that goes out and bus outfits, that tutoring centers that are run past 10 o'clock. And can you imagine in the United States, yes, at 10 o'clock at night. And can you imagine the United States going and finding kids who are studying math at 11 o'clock and then arresting the tutors for doing that? That would be. So other countries address the entire achievement issue differently than we do.
And this may be our last question. Somebody wants a clarification. The California Math Framework does not address what to do for students who struggle in math. That's a question. Does it recommend tiered systems of support for kids who struggle, or what those tiers should consist of? What does it tell you?
So from my reading, there's very little focus on intervention, even though in the general education world and public education, we've been working on multi-tiered systems of support for a long time. Teachers are getting much better at that. Your tier 1 instruction, then what do I do with my kids in tier 2 and tier 3? There's very little conversation about intervention in the framework itself. There's some vignettes that talk about, personalized learning and some things that you might do. There's the idea that you're differentiating for different students' needs within an open, engaging task, which you can do to some degree, but not for all the levels. But it was something I found lacking, where they did an incredible job with EL supports. There just wasn't very much, unless Tom knows quite a bit more, that I could find that really directly dealt with intervention.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, if the framework was concerned about struggling students and concerned about the best literature there is on how to address struggling students, it would have cited all those IES practice guides, and yet it doesn't. It doesn't cite any of the studies in those guides.
Great. That just about takes us to time. So I'm just going to end it there and say both to Tom Loveless and to Kara Jean Hyde and to those who have joined us today, thank you very much for this non-math guide. This has been a really illuminating conversation, and I suspect that this is a topic that we're going to be coming back to, if not specific to California, then certainly as we grapple with math achievement and learning loss in the years ahead. So thank you both very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you and have a good evening.